Great. Okay, Mitzi, take it away.
I'm gonna stop my video because it causes my computer to freak out, but y'all can hear me, right? Great. Okay. Cool. Hi. My name is Mitchy Zietler. I'm a senior research associate at Science, covering the software sector under the analyst Parker Snook. I'm very excited for the opportunity to discuss how alternative data is changing the investment research industry and making its way increasingly into the corporate world and enabling competitive intelligence, better understanding consumers and market opportunities, and increasingly driving business and investment decisions across all aspects of work. So Science is a data-driven research firm. We are a leader in the use of alternative data for investment research and corporate information services and consulting. On the investment research front, we cover over 180 companies throughout consumer, TMT, and industrial sectors. We provide services directly to the companies in the industries we cover, which is our corporate information services business, where we are providing competitive intelligence, information on consumer behavior, and other insights. We even have a new direct data platform run by former Reed student Spencer Marshall. The Sundial platform launched just a month ago and is already beating expectations. For a brief overview on alternative data, growth in data availability means explosive. It's growing at an exponential rate. I don't even say that necessarily as it relates to Science or finance, but just technologically. Data is transforming all aspects of our lives, and the same is true across all aspects of investment and corporate decision-making. Bridging disparate sources in an actionable and intuitive way is how jobs like mine add value to the field, and honestly, to any data-driven field. On the software team where I work, we currently manage about a dozen different data sources. Learning how each can be manipulated and visualized is part of the fun. Alternative data is information gathered from non-traditional information sources. What this means practically is that when bigwigs in finance talk about data, they mean financial data. They mean revenue numbers, they mean amortization numbers, they mean tax numbers. They mean anything you could find on a 10K or on a 10Q. Alternative data is data that is often exhaust data from other businesses, clickstream, app metric. It can span a wide range, but can include transaction data, engagement data, location data, and so on. Science has partnered with dozens of app providers and data providers. We ingest raw data feeds and have large data science and engineering teams to ingest, clean, and structure the data, which then feeds to the research and corporate information services teams to derive insights. These insights are used by investors, private equity firms, and corporate operators to gain a competitive edge. And ultimately, our product is insight. That can come from the form of customized written research, data dashboards, or customized projects, but it is ultimately our job to make sense of the data and communicate that insight in the context of the broader critical questions looming for investors and corporations. Science, in different iterations of the firm, has been doing this for the past 20 years, so we are very much pioneers in the space. All of this is meant to just illuminate how data is transforming our ability to provide a deep and near real-time understanding of companies and their consumers based on empirical data. This is something that's really groundbreaking that really isn't or wasn't being done by other people. Now a number of competitors have sprung up across the board, which is great. Competition makes industry. But the whole concept of alternative data is alternative because it's new. These insights housed in these varied data resources are increasingly critical to investors, private equity, and corporate operators to gain a competitive edge and better understand industries, companies, and consumers. All right, here you can see our sector coverage, both in this slide and this one. We cover consumer, technology, and industrial companies. This is an overview of our consumer sector. In the consumer sector, we use different types of transactional data to understand not just sales trends at an aggregate, merchant, or channel level, but also purchase level data that provides product mix, performance at a SKU level, and adoption of various services. For example, email receipt data that says not only did you purchase something from Amazon, but you purchased a t-shirt. So we know that t-shirts are doing pretty okay this month. In the industrial space, we use import-export data, often in the form of shipping or freight manifests, to monitor heavy equipment manufacturing or sales into the channel. In the tech and media space, we use transaction data to understand subscriber trends across various subscription services, and we use international web traffic and app metric data to understand engagement with those services. We use, for example, transaction data to see that you bought an Xbox 5, and we're using web traffic to see that you're on all the forums. So that means that you're really still using it. Sometimes our data doesn't necessarily point to a number, but to just a directional trend. And all of this is important. In the e-commerce space, we use web harvesting to understand listings, and in software, which I'll be talking about, we use a mix of web harvested data, web traffic data, and transactional data, and more to understand trends at a variety of software and services companies. All of this I'm going to talk about later with more examples. By way of background, I have been a research associate at mScience for 3 years. I cover cloud infrastructure, domain registration companies, customer relationship managers, e-commerce enablement platforms, personal and corporate email security, etc. This includes names such as Shopify, Salesforce, Wix, Adobe, GoDaddy, Norton Antivirus, Amazon's AWS platform, and more. Before this, I was a senior at Reed, majoring in economics, writing an econometric forward thesis on wholesale electricity markets. This also involved bridging many data sets and looking ultimately to distill all of this data into a single, easy to digest answer. With the rest of my time, I'm going to discuss 2 specific applications of alternative data that have been very transformational, speaking to companies specifically Wix and Salesforce. Does anyone have any burning questions so far? Cool, awesome.
I have one question.
Yeah.
Are all of those data dashboards considered alternative?
Yeah, they're all, so when I was first introduced to the concept of alternative data, I thought that maybe there was something like funky about it, but really any sort of data that's used in a finance context that isn't strictly financial is considered alternative data. So all of these are alternative data.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
That's super interesting. Yeah, because like when I think of data, like the internet, it seems like a pretty direct comparison. So thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, definitely. I was shocked to learn that credit card data was alternative because it seems like the most straightforward way to get at something. And as I'll talk about, credit card data is actually not something we use a lot on the software team. We use financial models, statistical models, and different accounting considerations to try to figure out and triangulate where we're going to go with the data. So, data triangulation. I'm going to focus on covering these companies that use multiple alternative data sets. Pretty evident that you want to incorporate as many views as possible into informing an investment thesis. Many investors want to understand fundamentals, i.e. fundamental financial data, and also hear from industry experts and see the data before completely forming their thesis. And this approach is valid in the alternative data landscape as well, because data can frequently be imperfect. So using an ensemble of data sources is usually valuable whenever it's possible. And there are a few reasons for this. For some companies, to model the total revenue, using multiple data sets is necessary. Netflix doesn't pay for AWS on a credit card, and all of Netflix is run through AWS. So to cover Amazon holistically, you'll have to have separate data for AWS, in addition to the credit card data you would have to have for Amazon's entire marketplace business. And even for their marketplace business, you might want a variety of transaction data sets from different geos, given that there's no global transactional data set that doesn't exist. Additionally, even the most reliable data sets can break or become no longer viable. The data provider can decide they no longer want to sell the data, or the data can deteriorate. Having multiple data sets allows us to perform quality assurance on other data sets and gives us a good avenue in case something goes wrong. Finally, data frequently is actually perfectly correlated to the KPI that it's trying to forecast. So if you can use multiple data sets to forecast the same KPI, you can gain conviction in your forecasts where correlation might be like way too high. Also something I'm going to get into. So to get to the meat of the presentation with our examples, today I want to demonstrate a pretty straightforward approach to the ensemble data method for a company called Wix, which many of you are pretty familiar with. They have commercials, they make websites. They have a website builder, which they sell as a subscription, primarily to small businesses like restaurants, bed and breakfasts, and e-commerce stores. So how is this company covered by the buy side currently? Like all software companies, buy-siders and sell-siders use a lot of channel partners, surveys, and expert networks. Some funds, hedge funds, long-only funds might look for Wix transactions in their credit card data if they have it. But using credit card data is tough because Wix only generates 55% of its revenue from the US and services a lot of businesses that might not be in the transaction panel. Our credit card data, like most credit card data, is US biased. It doesn't cover other geos. Wix, which is an international company, is going to have that as a major blind spot. Also, credit card data is good for small and medium-sized businesses and consumers, but not really good for anything over that. If you are Kylie Cosmetics, you're not paying for your Wix subscription with a credit card. You're paying for it with a corporate account. And that's an important bias to keep in mind. So understanding the prevailing methods of covering Wix, let me walk through how I approach using an ensemble method of alt data to cover a company. First, we need to figure out what the stock trades on. It's obviously less valuable to forecast KPIs that don't really move the stock. And by move the stock, I mean that there are some metrics that will be a lot more important to shareholders than other ones. And you can see that through earnings reports. Say Wix reports their Q4 earnings and revenue blows out the water, beats everything, does amazing, and the stock trades up 25%. That's great. That kind of tells you that revenue is something that's important to people. But there's also a reality in which revenue blows out the water, beats all expectations, and still the stock doesn't really move. When you're looking for KPIs, key performance indicators that move the needle, it's important to look for signs like that. The two KPIs that I would say are the most important for Wix are premium subscriber net additions and collections. We need to be able to forecast at least one of these metrics in order to be invaluable to investors, and ideally both. And also, ideally, we forecast and provide lots of color and financial backing to our finding. So what I'm going to use to forecast this metric is we talked about credit card data, and we may as well incorporate it into our ensemble. Credit card data is really rich. It's hard with software companies because many software companies are not actually selling their software to consumers. They're only selling them to other businesses, or B2Bs, as we call that. So that's a big blind spot with credit card data for us. But in general, it's a massive data set, and many people use it. Gold standard alternative data. We also like to use web harvested data. One of our data partners scrapes every website in the world and we can detect the presence of any Wix HTML traces. And finally, I like to use domain registration data. And I want to show what that is, even in a very simple statistical model. We can combine these data sources very effectively. Transaction data, credit card data, is valuable, despite its shortcomings, primarily because we can see transaction dollar values. It's rare to get a data set that'll actually give you a dollar value to something. And with products like Wix that have a wide variety of prices that they can assign to their products and have assigned over the years, depending on what the consumer wants, it's really important to be able to see prices. Other data sets that I'll go into don't have prices attached to them, and that makes it pretty hard. When a company is raising or lowering prices, we can't capture that effect in web harvested data, but we will see it in transaction data. But the most important shortcoming is that this data is geographically limited, and we might not be able to capture large business transactions. We have been able to drive additional value out of our transaction data by implying amortization logic. What this means is that we look at the frequency and magnitude of transactions and tag them as either monthly or annual. If someone is making the same transaction every month, then we can decide that that transaction is a monthly transaction. If someone's making the same transaction every year, we're going to decide that it's an annual transaction. Annual transactions are divided by 12 and spread over the next 12 months. This is an important part of revenue recognition. Most software companies do not report revenue as total sales, a practice compliant with generally accepted accounting principles, or GAAP. Instead, they report revenue as total sales recognized in the period. Practically, this means that if you buy a year subscription to Wix, in a month, you will have only used 1/12 of that subscription. So the company can only report 1/12 of the revenue from that purchase because that's all that's been used. Collections, however, is just total sales seen in the period. This metric does not call for any sort of recognition, and it is just total sales. In this chart, we see both metrics in our consumer transaction data tracked very closely together, as would be expected. The darker green line is collections, and the lighter green is revenue. From credit card data, we can also see average sale price, ASP, and average revenue per paying user, ARPPU, which is dollars divided by transactions and dollars divided by users. As you may notice, the revenue line here is far below the collections line and much less noisy. Given what I've said about how we calculate revenue versus collections, I hope that that kind of makes some intuitive sense, something to think about. We've also found domain registration data to be very effective. It's a lot of work, but we can ingest new domain registration data daily, so the frequency is excellent and the lag is very low. We've determined how to tag new domain registrations that are pointed to Wix name servers. And the advantage of this data is that it's daily, so we can capture real-time trends in Wix premium subscribership. And fun fact, this data is actually free to use. It's from whois.com. mScience pays for the data because free services online are never actually free when they're being used for commercial purposes. But if you're ever curious, this is a thing you can do. A downside to this data is that it's hard to capture churn in real time. And managing relationships with all those global name servers is tough. So we don't imagine that every registration is still an active website. And also, as I mentioned, we won't be able to see dollar values with this data. An additional upside, however, is that it lets us track domain registrars, and trends among registrars are useful to understanding the web presence marketplace. A registrar would be like GoDaddy, whereas Wix is just a name server. And all of this is really the minutia of internet infrastructure that is important to my work and how I think about this. And it's important if this is the sort of company you would want to cover, but is not necessarily super important to just understanding the concept of alternative data. The third data set we use is web harvested data. We have an exclusive partnership with the provider dataprovider.com. These guys scrape every domain on the public web, which allows us to not only track Wix subscribers, but also gives us a ton of intelligence on other factors around Wix's growth, like where growth is coming from geographically, and if Wix is overlapping with other software technologies that we cover. The downside of this data is that it takes an entire month to scrape the public web. Go figure. So temporal granularity isn't excellent. We're getting at best a data point every month. So each of these data sets have their own strengths and weaknesses, but what's really important is that by taking a simple average of every model output, which is the most basic way of performing an ensemble model, we estimated 5.795 million premium subscribers in SQ122, and Wix reported 5.740 million subscribers, which is an error of close to, I think, just 1%. All of the data sets we examined have over a 0.96 correlation to Wix, the reported premium subscriber count. As I hinted at earlier, these correlation numbers are going to be slightly biased because you're measuring the correlation of two trend lines that are both just going up and to the right. Because they simply have the same shape, their correlation is going to be closer together than if they had different shapes. All this being said is that in economics, you often do not get correlations this high. Don't despair. That's just finance. We also model to collections. Our consumer transaction data has over 0.99 correlation with reported collections. And we color this estimate then with the geographical bias we have learned from our web harvested data. By forecasting with a simple linear model, we would estimate collections of 340 in 5Q121. And then using our data triangulation, we came out to 551 million. This number is wrong. It's 551 million. I don't know if you can see this chart right here. This is the chart that we put after every report to our investors to let them know how well we did. And yeah, in this quarter, we actually were spot on, 0% error for collections. And collections is a pretty big name, or a pretty big metric for the name. And as a reminder, this is a matter of sales with no recognition, as opposed to revenue, which is amortized to fit recognition. But as a bit of context on this specific quarter, we called it an SQ121 as growing top line, but not as much as before. And we were right. You can see it. We were extremely right, really close on revenue and exactly on the dot for collections. However, the stock was down 14% after they reported this earnings call. And even though our estimates were spot on, maybe our investors did not do as well as they wanted to. Maybe they didn't see it tanking 14%. There's an element to how stocks move after earnings calls that are a little bit unpredictable. They're based on unrealistic expectations, especially in the wake of the pandemic. Sometimes stocks tank because these expectations are so out of line that it doesn't matter if we were 100% correct or not. And that's sort of the game of what's happening. All we can do is forecast to the best of our ability and give a case for how we feel the business is doing. Sometimes you can do everything right and it doesn't work out. And sometimes you can do most things right and it works out way better than you thought. That is the end of my spiel on Wix. Does anyone have any thoughts before I move on to my second case study? Okay, awesome. Salesforce. Salesforce is a very acquisitive company, meaning that it makes a lot of acquisitions, and it uses these purchases to build out different clouds, which are different ways to manage relationships based on the industry or department you're in. They have competitors like HubSpot, Freshworks, and Zendesk, and they provide these clouds, the biggest of which are Sales Cloud, Service Cloud, Marketing Cloud, and Platform. There are only a few competitors that can compete with this mega scale, offering their own versions of their clouds. As just a sales analytics software, Salesforce's Sales Cloud itself has its own competitors, but nothing to compete with it as a massive behemoth. Just the Service Cloud competes with Zendesk, but Zendesk doesn't offer 10 different clouds, if that works. As a recent example of this acquisition-minded strategy, most recently, Salesforce bought Slack for $27.7 billion. just over Slack's then valuation of $25 billion, according to Google Finance. Acquisitions like these have built Salesforce into the company that it is today, for better or worse. Salesforce is a behemoth. Most buy-side research only uses financial data, as a comprehensive alternative data portfolio is very hard to assemble. So Salesforce has divided their revenue and business segments among the clouds that it offers. Sales Cloud is built to offer support to sales teams with call logging analytics tools. Service Cloud is built for customer service and support. Marketing and Commerce Cloud offers both marketing-specific analytics tools and their e-commerce platform, Demandware, also known as Commerce Cloud. And platform includes tools like Tableau, MuleSoft, and Slack. So to look at Salesforce, one of our main data sources is our web harvested data from dataprovider.com. You've already gotten this spiel on dataprovider.com, but what really is useful about it here is that even with such weird different products, we're able to measure most of them with web harvested data, which allows us to compare growth apples to apples. There was a time when we were producing research on Salesforce, but we had to look at every single cloud with a different data source, which was still very useful, but quilting together research from so many different sources left a pretty big blind spot in that you can't really compare web harvested data one-to-one with transaction data. It just has different biases and different flaws. So this is great, and it gives us a good look into marketing, cloud, platform, sales, and service. We also use global Dmb data. Global Dmb data comes from a provider that has a partnership with a lot of top e-commerce enablement platforms. It provides a service that sits on top of Google Analytics, and all of their partners know that they are harvesting data from them in exchange for using this service. Compliance-wise, this means that this data is actually very compliant. There is a lot more awareness and understanding from the people whose data is being harvested that their data is being harvested. Compliance is really important to us because we expect compliance regulations to be competitive, and we want to keep up with data harvesting methods. We are not subject to compliance regulations ourselves, but our clients are, and we do not want to expose them to non-compliant material. This data here represents Commerce Cloud, which is made from the acquisition of Demandware. I thought this slide would be interesting to include. We used to use web traffic data for a variety of use cases, and it was very interesting for Salesforce's platform. However, clickstream data, also known as web traffic data, is something that we no longer use because it really teeters a line compliance-wise. While it is technically okay, there is a general feeling that it will not be okay in the next few months to the next few years. So we proactively cut it out of our research. The reason why we don't think it's going to be okay is because many people read terms and conditions and click agree without really knowing what they're agreeing to. Many of us are having our web traffic data harvested without really knowing it. And while at some point we did agree and consent to that sort of harvesting, that's not really the standard that compliance regulations will be looking for. So now, even though this was something that we used to use, it's something that we now try to estimate with web harvested data. Yeah, I thought this would be interesting to include this slide because even though web traffic data doesn't really, it's not something we do currently. This is kind of an example of how the industry is constantly changing. Web traffic data is very interesting, and it's unfortunate that we can't use it. Yeah, and that's, there's constant problems that come up, and we're always trying to look for interesting solutions to them. Yeah, so some of the results of this. Our web harvested data has over 0.99 correlation with reported Service Cloud revenue. By forecasting with a simple linear model, we would estimate Service Cloud revenue of 1.647 in FQ322. and we reported that Service Cloud revenue of 1.658 in the quarter. Sales Cloud has funky financial quarters because their financial year ends in January. So SQ3 2022 was mid last year. This is the box we provide for all of our clients whenever someone reports. I thought it might be interesting to look in general at some of our results from this quarter. As you can see, they're sort of mixed. We did better on several fronts, but worse on others. Yeah, I've included a number of these actual results in the time series of the sample data set that I emailed out to everyone about 2 hours ago, along with time series of the global Dmb data, the web harvested data, and the same for Wix, their revenue and collections actuals alongside the data I've mentioned in the presentation. Yeah, that went a bit shorter than I thought, but if anyone has any questions, I would love to field them. I know I threw out a bunch of terms that aren't really taught at Reed, terms that I've learned over the past 3 years by taking independent accounting classes and reading investor transcripts. So yeah, if there were any words or terms you want additional clarification on, yeah, I can do my best. Yeah, I yield the floor to questions.
Do you recommend, or how necessary do you think it is to take independent accounting classes after Reed? Because that's something, not just in regards to accounting, but like other skills, specifically statistical stuff. Like, do you recommend that? Is that 100% necessary?
I would honestly say, so the accounting classes I took were just online classes, like from Coursera. And I would definitely recommend it. I used to think accounting was a really easy way to do math, and it is. It's like once you get the basics down, it's pretty easy, but it's nice to have a handle on it and know the language of it. I think it's useful in basically any job that functions as a business in some way, which is most jobs, I believe. Yeah, I would recommend it. You're not really going to get much information on accounting at Reed for all the cool things that Reed teaches you. That's not really something that Reed is attempting to teach. And it's pretty easy to learn out online if you like dedicate like a week to it, maybe 2 weeks. Yeah, I would totally recommend that.
I guess a question I had is, how do you feel like the skills or experiences that you built at Reed have helped you in like your post-Reed career and life?
Amazing question. Yeah. I think Reed teaches a lot of critical thinking. I think most people come into Reed as already critical thinkers with that skill, but it really hones it and gives you a lot of good experience with it. I would also say that one thing I didn't expect from being an econ major to help me in my like post-Reed life is having experience writing outside of Hume or humanities context of writing. Because the way you write a Hume paper is not the way you write a research report. I mean, the way you would write an econ essay for an exam is not the way you'd write a research report, but it's a lot closer. And that I think is pretty jarring when you step out of a college environment and into a job environment, is learning how to change your writing to be both more accessible and more succinct. And also, you know, seeing the way maybe your bosses and your peers write and trying to find an interesting medium. The writings, the critical thinking, and the time management is massive. You have to manage your time more than you will ever have to manage your time ever at Reed, I think, except maybe if you go to a grad school, which I haven't done, but I assume that there's a lot of time management involved in that as well. But as far as jobs go, having time management as just in your head like that, you're golden and you don't even realize it. I think you learn more than enough statistics as an econ major at Reed to function in the world, especially in a finance context. If you feel like you need more statistics classes, go for it. But I think that y'all are probably fine on that front. I can also do like a general like rant about finding a job after Reed. I was sort of lucky in that a friend of mine that I did a group project with worked at Science. And he was 2 years older than me, so like had already had this job at Science for a while and recommended me for the job. I started off as an intern because I had literally no finance background. And when I graduated, they hired me full time. It was very cool. Something I've noticed being out of Reed is that everything is so much easier. It's crazy. It really is. Even the hardest things are still so much easier than you think they're going to be. Going to Reed is kind of like a sort of resistance training, socially, academically, all around. And these jobs are they have a learning curve, but that learning curve, once it levels out, you are really, really in a really amazing position. And jobs like Science are really interesting as on their own, but will also do a lot to carry you into your second job or your third job. And my experience with jobs, as someone who got a job immediately out of college, and as someone who has a large peer group who graduated in 2020 and wasn't able to do that, your first job is the hardest one to get. But after that, it does become increasingly easier and easier. There's a sort of house training that needs to happen, I think, when you get your first entry-level job, where you're trained not just to do the job, but how to be in an office and work with people and write like you work in an office and talk to people. Things that I think we all think we have down, but no one actually has down. And just seeing that you're quote unquote house trained like that does a lot for your second or third employer. Yeah, general rant. I don't know if you guys agree with me, but if you don't, hit me up in 4 years and tell me what you think.
I guess a follow-up question to that. You said that you felt like econ trained you enough statistically for jobs, and I guess like my question from that is, do you feel like out of undergrad employers expect you to have some type of experience with or like mastery over hard skills like coding languages, or do you feel like they're looking for more so for folks that they enjoy working with and folks that they think have the aptitude to learn skills like that?
I think it's both. I think it's definitely both. I am 100% not going to say fake it till you make it on the record. Do not fake a skill that you don't have. But I think as Reed students, people are more acclimated in general to learn on the job than to like learn via a class almost. And that's sort of the ethos behind project-based learning at Reed. I didn't really learn, I like learned a little bit of coding at Reed. I learned enough R to start my thesis and then basically had to stumble through my thesis with the coding knowledge I had, and that let me stumble into this job. I think that jobs want to see that you are someone who learns well and learns quickly. I think that's really hard to demonstrate. If you can find a way to demonstrate it, then that's great. And make that be the first thing out of your mouth in an interview. But they're definitely looking for at least some knowledge of hard skills as well. And there are like many coding websites that provide at the very least an intro. I think with all online learning, it's really easy to hit a block after you get to about like the first level of knowing something. But as long as you get to the first level, it's a lot easier to learn the rest of it in a real environment. But jobs like self-learners. They do. And yeah, I think that Reed students are good at quote unquote learning on the job and good at quote unquote self-learning, but maybe aren't used to being taught how to do a skill. And that I don't know how familiar any of you are with Excel. Kind of a silly thing to say. If you are looking into finance as a job, when people say they are skilled at Excel, it doesn't mean that they know how to like make new tabs and like use the sum function. It means they're like incredibly skilled at Excel, like massively skilled at Excel in ways that you couldn't dream of. To the point where there are like $3,000 like 4-day finance boot camps that teach you how to use Excel for finance. I know this because I took one last year. Like it's a massive industry. So that's something interesting to look into. The Excel workbook that I sent everyone earlier in the day, you can really easily play around with that, do like equals correl to find a correlation. You can do forecast.linear and input the data in the data column or the data tabs as X's and the reported numbers in the reported tabs as Y's, and sort of see what you think, how close our data is to whatever. And there's fun variations you can do on that. And I formatted it very simply because I don't know if any of you like really enjoy coding, but if you wanted to try to upload it into RStudio and then call each worksheet in the worksheet a separate data set, that's something you should be able to do pretty easily based on how it's formatted, very low format worksheet. Yeah, if you have something you wanted to play around with today, probably could play around with that for like 10 to 15 minutes. Yeah. And if you have any pressing questions for mScience, the firm, you can email insights@mscience.com and you will get an answer. All right, cool. Last call for questions. Speak now or forever hold your peace. You can always reach out to me, miriam.zitler@mscience.com. I believe it's the email that I sent you my email from.
I guess the last question is, what's next for you?
Yeah, that is a great question. I am looking to transition to some sort of role soon that answers more questions as opposed to producing more research. I found that I have a better time answering questions and trying to find creative ways to look into a question than to produce research. which seem the way I'm saying them to be very similar things, but more so the way that the job is structured. I actually have a lot of thoughts on this that would be happy to talk about further when at another time. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Awesome. All right. I hid my Zoom controls, but I'm gonna stop sharing.